Turn now to our next reading of Scripture, coming from the book of Genesis, chapter 25, verses 19 through 24. This is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took his wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel and the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord responded to his plea, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children struggled in her womb. And she said, "If so, why do I exist?" She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two separate peoples shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first one emerged red, like a hairy mantle all over, so they named him Esau. Then his brother emerged, holding on to the heel of Esau, so they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac favored Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah favored Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the open, famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I am famished," which is why he was named Edom. And Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm at the point of death, so of what use is my birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him, sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, and he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. And this is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. Sibling rivalry. The art of the struggle between siblings. Brothers, sisters, sister and a brother, whatever. Many of us are more than familiar with it, from growing up ourselves with siblings or from seeing it in our kids maybe. As Children's Hospital defines it, it's the jealousy and competition and fighting between siblings. It's a concern for almost all parents of two or more kids. Problems often start right after birth of the second child. Sibling rivalry usually continues throughout childhood and can be very frustrating and stressful to parents. Well, what we've got before us today didn't wait until after the kids were born. The rivalry between these two was well underway while they were still in the womb. The situation begins with another miracle pregnancy. You know, it doesn't get the airtime that the other stories do, like Sarah and Abraham, but it's a very, very similar situation. Missing a lot more of the details, we've got to put two and two together to gain more perspective about this story. Little clues in the text let us know that Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah, and then he was 60 when the kids were born. So that makes 20 years that they spent unable to have children. It was indeed a hard time for them, as one author describes it, 20 years of barrenness, of frustration every month as a reminder came that pregnancy has not occurred. 20 years of failure, shame, and frustration. Struggling with all the troubling emotions, worries, and beliefs and stereotypes that went along with not being able to have children, especially at that time. Now, at some point during that time span of the 20 years, Isaac prayed to God about it and pleaded with God that they might have children. And God responded. God's power once again proves able to provide life against all odds. And Rebekah did indeed get pregnant. And there, the next struggle began. After all this they'd already gone through, Rebekah feels the rivalry at play in her womb already. Talk about feeling frustrated and stressed out about the conflict between your kids. Now, that's totally where she's at this time, and the kids haven't even been born yet. Why do I even exist? She asked the Lord. All this time just to get pregnant in the first place. Now all this rumbling. Must feel like it's going to be a failed pregnancy. All the ruckus going on in there. But what's actually going on is much bigger. God explains that this is the beginning of a very long rivalry to come, generations upon generations. Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb that will be at odds with one another for a long time to come. The younger will prevail over the older. In other words, this is an origin story. Beginning in the womb, these 2 unborn twins begin their conflict. When they're born, Esau arrives first, and Jacob is hot on his tail, clinging to Esau's heel on the way out. Then once they've grown up, they wind up being total opposites. Esau is the hunter, Isaac prefers Esau, Jacob stays at camp, Rebekah prefers Jacob. Esau comes home one day after being out in the wild. He's famished, and he finds Jacob cooking this lentil stew. Jacob uses this opportunity to his advantage, telling Esau, "Oh, you want some of this stew, huh? Sell me your birthright." And so he's just totally famished and gives in to it. Doesn't even think, what's my birthright going to do for me? I'm about to die. Okay, you can have it. And Jacob's trickery wins. Esau can't see past his fatigue and his empty stomach, so he agrees. Later on, the birthright thing is solidified as Jacob steps in another story, steps in for Esau's blessing when he's not really supposed to. And Rebekah kind of helps set this whole thing up. And Jacob steps in there when his father Isaac can't see very well, and he gets the blessing that Esau is supposed to get. So not only does he secure the birthright, but then he also secures the blessing right before their father dies. The future for the family all ends up with Jacob. Therefore, given this is an origin story, we understand why the Israelites and the Edomites have always been in conflict, and why Israel emerges as the stronger of the two. Now, these most ancient stories of the Bible, they're very interesting to say the least. Of course, we want whoever's chosen by God to be chosen because they're this upstanding individual who really deserves it, but that's just often not the case. Abraham made his share of slip-ups that really put a damper on his character, like telling Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife, causing a plague to come down. He made his mistakes. It was just his unquestioning faith that redeems him as God's choice. Isaac doesn't really do much to show himself worthy of what he gets either over Ishmael. And now Jacob, here in this story, he doesn't show himself worthy of what he gets Quite the opposite, really. Jacob just goes in the other direction. He shows himself to be a trickster who manipulates his way to the top. The only consistent thing we find here about God's choosing is that one who God chooses ends up being faithful and does what God tells them to do. But beyond that, the only real consistent thing is that God tends to choose the weaker, the less powerful, the one who really has to struggle to make it. That carries over into God lending special ear to the oppressed, the downtrodden of society. It also enlightens us to how the people of Israel understand themselves as a weaker and smaller group of people among neighboring kingdoms and nations who've always had to struggle just to survive and hold on to their place in the world. It's not that they're better than anyone else, not that they prove themselves more worthy, just that there is great blessing in the struggle. Jacob grabbed Esau's heel coming out of the womb, and he wouldn't let go. He was grabbing that birthright and God's blessing, and he wouldn't let go. That's Israel grabbing at their place in the world and their identity as God's people and not letting go. We don't deserve it. We're not worthy of it, as we see ourselves as spiritual ancestors of Israel, grabbing at God's grace and God's calling and not letting go. It's not about who deserves it. It's about the struggle and refusing to let go of it. We didn't earn it, but we're more than willing to struggle for it and cling to it because we know that God has given it to us and is continuing to give. Paul talks about this in Romans. We know that God has blessed us with grace. We know that God has called us to carry on God's work. And because of that, we struggle every day to leave our sin behind and to walk only in the Spirit. Now, beyond that personal struggle, we've got things like our church-wide struggle that we've got to adapt to new times. Last week, when we had our special guest preacher, we talked about the topic of church revitalization, and I'm very thankful for that. I think we needed to hear Shawnee Community Christian's story and gain some important perspective regarding where we are today, along with new and creative directions to possibly go. That's a big reminder that we're not alone in the challenges that we face, that there very much is hope, and that there are things that can be done in our struggle to keep our little hub for sharing the gospel open and moving forward with Christ's mission. A lot more of this hope was and celebration was shared at the General Assembly, as we, among many of our disciples' churches, are in the same tough situation, along with many mainline and other churches across the board. In some ways, we are on our own here, and in some ways, we're just part of a bigger picture. In both cases, we are right in the middle of our struggle to survive and thrive in today's world. The sibling rivalry presented to us today should bear witness to us that there is great blessing in the struggle itself. Between siblings, the jealousy, the competition, and fighting, it tends to lead to a greater sense of identity, maturity, strength, and endurance. Maybe not in every case, but it does at least grant the opportunity for that kind of growth. In the struggle, there is always opportunity for growth. The struggle itself is a good thing. The struggle is worth it. The struggle is blessing. So let us continue fighting the good fight, be it our spiritual and personal struggles against sin, our church-wide struggle to survive and thrive in today's world, maybe our struggles with grief while our hearts are aching, and whatever else it may be that's placed before us. May we, with everything we've got, hold on to what's ours. God's grace and God's calling for us to share the gospel. Amen.